So how many of you are familiar with a man named John Wise? Lived between 1640 to 1725. Anyone familiar? Okay, well, no one knows generally, while I'm giving a tour, who John Wise is. However, all of you know the impact that John Wise had on his country. So who was John Wise? John Wise was a Harvard-educated preacher. Now, it's really interesting to kind of start right there. What do you mean Harvard-educated preacher? Well, that's because Ivy Leagues back then, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, I don't know if you guys already went over this in the class, but they all started as minister schools to train up ministers of the gospel to release them across the country to preach the word of God. Unfortunately, as we look at those same Ivy League schools today, they're weapons against the very same truth that they initially started to promote, which also tells you that when you're starting an organization, you better do good succession planning. Otherwise, it's going to turn to something that you don't want it to. With that being said, John Wise, Harvard-educated preacher, and he was alive during the colonial era. And while he was alive, there was a man who was his arch nemesis. The man's name was Edmund Andros. Who's familiar with Edmund Andros? So Edmund Andros was the first colonial despot of America. What happened was that eventually he was promoted to Major General by King Charles. If you look to my left right here, you are actually looking at the commission that King Charles gave Edmund Andros to make him commander. Sorry?
Which Charles?
The first. Okay. To make him commander of all of the forces in Barbados. Now, what does that mean? Why is that important? Because all of Great Britain's military power at that time to protect all of the colonies in the New World were located in Barbados. That means if he just became the commander over all those units, he just became the most powerful man in all of the New World. Well, after King Charles died and a new monarch came to the throne, that monarch actually decided that not only are you going to maintain control over those armies, but we are going to give you the authority of going to all of the New England colonies and destroy every individual legislative seal of those colonies and create something called the monolith and dominion of New England. Well, after he received that power, as tyrants do, he decided to exercise it. He went to the New England colonies, went to every individual New England colony and destroyed their individual seals, creating that monolith super colony. When he did that, he ended up raising taxes. He ended up jailing political dissidents, and he also destroyed religious freedom. Now, very few people at that time were willing to stand up against Andros. And one of those men who chose to stand up was this guy right here, John Wise. And in 1689, he launched multiple petitions against Edmund Andros, but specifically, his most effective work was done in the pulpit. You see, he would stand up and he would say, Edmund, what are you doing? Because all of the authority that had been granted to you under heaven was given to you for a particular purpose. What was that purpose? Well, we understand as New Testament Christians that the purpose of government under Romans 13 is to promote justice across the land and to bring the sword against all those who practice lawlessness and evil. And that's exactly what John Wise understood. But there begins a question. And that question is, what happens when the very institution that is supposed to promote justice across the land becomes the very system and mechanism by which injustice is then spread to the rest of us? You see, Romans 13 doesn't cover that portion. Well, John Wise had that answer. And John Wise said to stand no matter what it costs you. And for a while, he ended up promoting rallies. He continued to preach sermons. As a matter of fact, many historians believe that he actually led the tax revolt in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Why is Ipswich, Massachusetts important? Because they believe it was from that locality the idea of taxation without representation was finally born and put into a political movement. The document that you are looking at right here is the tax receipt that the town of Ipswich, Massachusetts had to pay Edmund Andros after John Wise was imprisoned and they lost that fight. You guys are looking at right here the birth of taxation without representation. And I'll hand this out so you guys can look at it right here. But after John Wise was released from prison, he spent about 2 years there. Eventually, Edmund Andros was deposed and sent back to Great Britain. And as the years would pass, he would continue writing sermons about some of the work that he had done during those years. And specifically, he ended up promulgating this particular book. He ended up publishing it in 1717, I believe. It's called A Vindication of the Government of the New England Churches, in which he starts recounting what Edmund Andros had done at that period. And he begins talking about ideas like popular sovereignty. He starts talking about ideas like inalienable rights. Does any of this sound familiar to you? In 1689, again, historians believe he was the purveyor of taxation without representation. You see, many of you did not know who John Wise was before this talk, but you absolutely know the document that he helped inspire. As a matter of fact, many historians believe that from his writings in these sermons that were eventually reprinted by the Sons of Liberty in 1772 during the Revolutionary War, that they would read the collection of these sermons, and upon this understanding would help draft the Declaration of Independence. And so, see, there's a big moral story behind this as well. Even though none of us remembered who this man was, we absolutely know the impact that he had on this country. Why? Well, Isaiah tells us why. Because every time you speak the truth, you speak the essence of God himself. And when you speak the truth, God will never return void. And that is exactly what this man did for all of those decades of his life. And he was willing to preach that truth in the pulpit. How many churches today completely abdicate their duty to talk about moral issues because, oh, Elijah, it's just too political. I don't want to talk about abortion. I don't want to talk about the national debt. I don't want to talk about transgenderism. I don't necessarily feel equipped to talk about these issues, but we just want to be inclusive for all. Understand this. The Word of God is meant to be offensive. And what blows my mind is when you read the 10 Commandments. Last time I checked, thou shalt not murder is in there. And last time I looked at abortion, 64 million babies gone since 1973. This is not a political issue. This is a moral issue. And if you refuse to talk about those issues in the pulpit, you have abdicated your duty as a minister of God. Oh, Elijah, I don't want to talk about the national debt. We are $34 trillion in debt, not including our unfunded liabilities, which exceed $120 trillion. And last time I read the 10 Commandments, theft was in there. And we have stolen from 6 generations of unborn Americans. This isn't a political issue. This is a matter of taking from people who aren't even on this planet yet, even if we don't kill them by then. It's utterly ridiculous. But he knew his place. Do you know why? Because he knew the place that the Word of God had in society. And what place does it have in society? Everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. But I can't promise you'll be remembered. Again, not very many people remembered this guy, but you remembered his impact. So I can't promise that as you do good in this life, that people will build you monuments. I can't promise that you'll have a statue of yourself one day. I can't promise you that people will remember your name. But this is what I can promise. When you speak the truth will never return void. Because it is in God that we live and move and have our being. I know Tim already talked about this a little bit yesterday, but he spoke of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence from 1829 after Thomas Jefferson Randolph, which was Thomas Jefferson's grandson, went into his home after he passed away in 1826. The same day that That's what happens when you scream all the time.
We tried to find something more passionate.
We're excitement level. Just kidding. Exactly. We're in church here.
So 1826, July 4, Thomas Jefferson would pass away. He also passed away on the same day as
John Adams.
Very good, John Adams. Well, around that time, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Thomas Jefferson's grandson, ended up going into Monticello and finding these 4 pieces of paper. Well, these 4 pieces of paper, as you already know, is the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the reason why this draft is important is because of what was eventually taken away and not actually added in the final draft. Now, before I go into any more of this story, I like to touch on a little anecdote of myself. As Tim talked about before, I used to work in the Texas House of Representatives during the 86th and 87th legislative sessions, not 1986 or 87, that was 2019 and 2021. And while I was there, I asked representatives and senators and lobbyists a very simple question. And that question was, what do you think makes America exceptional? And I received a range of incredibly disappointing answers. Like, well, Elijah, Republicans and Democrats, well, Elijah, what makes America great is the fact that we have the most powerful military on the face of the planet. Or what makes America great is that we are leaders in medical innovation and invention. Or what makes America great is the fact that we have the most robust economy the world has ever seen. It's built on fiat currency. And then when I would ask even more conservative representatives, I would get, unfortunately, what amounts today as more meaningless platitudes. Like, well, Elijah, freedom and liberty and justice for all. Yeah, what does that mean? I'm not saying it doesn't have a meaning, but we keep repeating these things and parroting them over and over and over again. It's like it's lost its gumption. It's lost its force of will. And I only met one representative, and we had the honor of inviting him to the Summer Institute last week. I only met one representative who actually articulated the promise and the acknowledged truth that made America different.
He also speaks for wall builders, by the way.
Oh, that's right. His name was Matt Krause, Representative Matt Krause. And he said, well, Elijah, what makes this nation different is what's found in our final draft of the Declaration of Independence. You all have probably heard of it before. It goes like this: that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So you see, what makes America great, what makes America exceptional, what makes America stand apart from all of the other nations on the face of the planet is the fact that we understand that all of our freedom, all of our liberty, and all of our blessings flow from God. And so it doesn't matter what laws passed by Congress, what order is signed by our current president, or what opinion is rendered by the Supreme Court, because we believe all of our freedom, liberty, and blessings flow from God. That's what makes us different. That's what made us exceptional. Because when we understood that, government's proper role was only to defend the rights that God had already endowed you. That's what led to the greatest proliferation of the human mind, which enabled all of those blessings that those representatives had mistaken as the thing that made us different. Those were only the derivatives from a fundamental understanding that made us different. And tell me, what other nation in human history understood this principle and articulated it so beautifully until 1776? Not a single one. Now, does that mean America's perfect? Does that mean America doesn't have sin? Does that mean that America hasn't fallen prey to some of the schemes of Satan? As I mentioned before, we've murdered up 64 million babies, okay? We're in it right now. But when we say American exceptionalism, we don't mean that America didn't make and isn't making mistakes. What we mean is throughout our history, while those mistakes were being made, oftentimes America was on the cutting edge of freedom and the tip of the spear of liberty for humanity, which is why this document that you learned about yesterday is so important. You guys already know that the last grievance, which is the longest grievance in that entire document, talks about the abolition of slavery and how the very nature of our government, how we wanted to start everything out, was acknowledging that basic truth. But we weren't able to get there. Why? As what may have been talked about already, 2 states ended up voting no. That would be South Carolina and Georgia. The other 11 colonies, or states, depending on how you want to look at it at that point, did not object to putting that grievance into the king, that he had waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended the king, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. And that piratical warfare, that opprobrium of infidel powers, was the warfare of a, quote, Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. And there is no ambiguity in those statements, because you can clearly see the underlining, the bolding, and the capitalization that Thomas Jefferson so acutely decided to utilize in making sure his recipient understood that what truly makes America different is that here in this land, all men are created equal. The only other words in this entire document that are capitalized are United States of America and men. I choose to think that that is not an accident, that you can very easily connect those 2 things. That of all the experiments of the world of starting a new nation, that was going to be our biggest premise of all. So, all right, Austin, I think I'm going to hand it over to you.